Marcel Dupont stood in his barn on a cold November morning in 1942, staring at the Wehrmacht requisition order nailed to his door. The document, stamped with the official eagle and swastika of the Third Reich, demanded he deliver 12 tons of wheat to the German collection depot in Vichy by the end of the week. Failure to comply would result in immediate arrest and confiscation of his farm. The 47-year-old farmer from the Auvergne region of central France had seen these orders before. Every farmer in occupied France had. Since the armistice of June 1940, the Germans had systematically stripped the French countryside of food, redirecting grain, livestock and produce to feed the Wehrmacht and the German homeland. But this order was different. This order would take everything. Marcel ran the calculations in his head. 12 tons represented nearly his entire harvest. If he complied, his family would starve through the winter. His wife, his 3 children, his elderly parents living in the farmhouse, they'd have nothing. The Germans left just enough for farmers to plant next season's crop, but not enough to eat. That was the equation of occupation. You could choose to feed the enemy or feed your family, but never both. Most people would have grumbled, cursed the Germans under their breath, and complied. The alternative meant prison, torture, or execution. The Gestapo didn't tolerate defiance, and the Vichy government, France's collaborationist regime, enforced German agricultural quotas with ruthless efficiency. Informers were everywhere. Your neighbour might report you for hiding a sack of flour. The local mayor, appointed by Vichy, tracked every farm's production and reported shortfalls to German authorities. But Marcel Dupont wasn't looking at just his own family's survival. Hidden in the forests surrounding his farm, living in caves and abandoned shepherds' huts, were approximately 200 men and women of the French resistance. They called themselves the Maquis, named after the dense scrubland of the Mediterranean coast where the first resistance groups had hidden. These fighters had fled forced labour conscription, escaped from German prisons, or simply refused to accept Nazi occupation. They conducted sabotage operations against German supply lines, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and prepared for the day France would be liberated. And they were starving. The Maquis survived on whatever they could steal, beg, or forage. Sympathetic farmers would leave small amounts of food at predetermined drop points, a few potatoes here, some bread there, never enough to draw German attention. But winter was coming, and the forests offered nothing edible. Without a reliable food source, the resistance network in the Auvergne would collapse. Fighters would be forced to surrender, flee to other regions, or die from exposure and malnutrition. Marcel had been supporting the Maquis since 1941, providing small amounts of food when he could spare it. He'd met their local commander, a former army captain named Henri Valois, who'd explained the desperate situation. The resistance network stretched across 6 departments in central France, coordinating with British intelligence through radio operators who'd been parachuted in. They'd sabotaged rail lines, ambushed German patrols, and provided crucial intelligence about Wehrmacht movements. But intelligence meant nothing if the fighters were too weak from hunger to operate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. So Marcel stood in his barn, looking at that requisition order, and made a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or get him killed. He wasn't going to deliver 12 tons of wheat to the Germans. He was going to steal it from himself and feed the resistance. The plan was insane. The logistics alone seemed impossible. How do you hide 12 tons of grain? How do you transport it through German-controlled territory without being caught? How do you distribute it to resistance fighters scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of forest without alerting the Gestapo? And, most critically, how do you explain to the Germans why your harvest suddenly disappeared? Marcel spent 3 days working out the details. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help from people he could trust absolutely, because a single informer would doom everyone involved. He approached his brother-in-law, Jacques, who farmed adjacent land. Jacques was a cautious man, risk-averse by nature. But he also had two sons who joined the Marquis rather than accept conscription for forced labour in German factories. When Marcel explained the plan, Jacques stared at him for a long moment, then simply nodded. Next, Marcel contacted the village priest, Father Antoine. The Catholic Church in France occupied a complicated position during the occupation. Some clergy collaborated openly with Vichy, others quietly resisted. Father Antoine belonged to the latter category. He'd been sheltering escaped prisoners of war in the church basement and had connections to resistance networks throughout the region. When Marcel proposed using the church as a coordination point, the priest agreed without hesitation. The final conspirator was unexpected. Madame Chevalier owned the local grain mill, a substantial operation that processed wheat for dozens of farms in the area. She was a widow in her 60s, known for her sharp business sense and sharper tongue. Nobody suspected her of resistance sympathies. That made her perfect. Marcel visited the mill on the pretense of discussing milling schedules and quietly laid out his plan. Madame Chevalier listened, asked 3 pointed questions about logistics, then agreed to help. Here's how the theft would work. Marcel and Jacques would report to German authorities that their harvests had been damaged by rot, a common problem in the damp autumn of 1942. They'd show German inspectors carefully prepared evidence, mouldy grain mixed into good wheat, to create the appearance of widespread contamination. The inspectors, mostly bored Wehrmacht administrators who knew nothing about agriculture, would accept the loss and reduce the requisition orders accordingly. Meanwhile, the actual grain would be hidden in plain sight. Madame Chevalier would falsify her mill records to show that she'd processed much less wheat than she actually received. The surplus would be bagged in unmarked sacks and stored in the mill's basement, disguised among legitimate inventory. The mill was inspected regularly by Vichy officials, but they checked production totals against recorded deliveries. They never actually counted physical sacks of flour. The distribution network would run through Father Antoine's church. Resistance fighters would arrive at night, individually or in small groups, dressed as ordinary parishioners coming for confession or prayer. They'd enter through the front door and leave through a rear entrance that opened onto a narrow alley. In between, they'd descend to the basement, where bags of flour and grain would be waiting. Each fighter could carry approximately 20 kilograms, hidden under their clothes or in packs that looked like personal belongings. The operation began on November 15, 1942. Marcel and Jacques had spent 2 weeks preparing their evidence of crop damage. They'd mixed mouldy grain from a genuinely contaminated batch into samples that would be shown to German inspectors. They'd carefully documented the supposed rot, creating fake inventory sheets that showed progressive losses. When the Wehrmacht agricultural inspector arrived, a lieutenant named Weber, who spoke minimal French and cared primarily about meeting his quota for the regional command, Marcel walked at him through the fields with theatrical despair. Lieutenant Weber examined the mouldy samples, wrinkled his nose at the smell, and made notes in his ledger. He reduced Marcel's delivery requirement from 12 tons to 4 tons, a figure Marcel had calculated would be sustainable while still leaving enough to feed his family and divert surplus to the Marquis. Jacques received a similar reduction. Between them, they'd freed up approximately 16 tons of grain that officially no longer existed. The next challenge was transportation. German patrols monitored all major roads, stopping vehicles to check cargo against transit permits. Farmers were allowed to transport grain to designated mills, but quantities were strictly controlled. Moving 16 tons without paperwork would be impossible on main roads, so they didn't use main roads. The Auvergne region is mountainous terrain, crisscrossed by ancient farm tracks and forest paths that dated back centuries. Marcel and Jacques knew every trail within 20 kilometers. They'd hunted these woods as boys, courted their wives on evening walks through these forests. Now that intimate knowledge became a tactical asset. Over 3 weeks, working only at night, they used horse-drawn carts to move grain from their farms to Madame Chevalier's mill. The carts travelled through forests, avoiding roads entirely. They moved in complete darkness, no lanterns, relying on the horses' familiarity with the paths and Marcel's navigation by starlight. Each trip carried approximately 500 kilograms, as much as the horses could pull through rough terrain. They made 32 trips total, each one a 6-hour round journey through forests that could hide German patrols, Vichy police, or simply conceal a broken axle that would strand them with illegal cargo. They never encountered a single checkpoint. The Germans and Vichy authorities focused their attention on roads and villages. They never imagined that anyone would be crazy, enough to transport tons of contraband through mountain forests in the middle of the night. That blindness, that assumption that criminals would take the easy path, created the operational space Marcel needed. By early December 1942, Madame Chevalier's mill basement held approximately 16 tons of wheat and flour that didn't officially exist. Now came the most dangerous phase: distribution. Father Antoine coordinated with resistance cells through a network of couriers, mostly women who drew less German suspicion than men of military age. The couriers travelled between villages carrying verbal messages, never written communication that could be intercepted. Each resistance cell received instructions on when to send fighters to the church and how many bags they could collect. The distribution began on December 7, 1942, and continued every night for 3 weeks. Resistance fighters would arrive at the church between sunset and midnight, entering ones or twos to avoid drawing attention. Father Antoine would be in the main chapel, available if any German patrol happened to investigate, ready to explain that he was preparing for evening mass or hearing confessions. The fighters would descend to the basement through a door hidden behind the altar, collect their grain, and exit through the rear entrance into the alley. The system worked because of its simplicity and the cover provided by normal church activities. People visited churches at all hours during the occupation. They came to pray for absent loved ones, to seek comfort, to confess sins both real and imagined. A steady trickle of visitors to Father Antoine's church attracted no attention whatsoever. What the Germans and Vichy police didn't realize was that approximately 15% of those visitors were armed resistance fighters, collecting food that would sustain their operations through the winter. The Maquis fighters who collected grain from Father Antoine's church represented a cross-section of French society that had chosen resistance over submission. There were former soldiers who'd refused to accept the armistice, workers who'd fled forced labor conscription, Jews escaping deportation, communists who'd been resisting since the Nazi-Soviet pact collapsed, and ordinary citizens who simply couldn't tolerate occupation. What united them was desperation and determination. Life in the Maquis was brutal. The fighters lived in forest camps, sleeping in caves or crude shelters built from branches and salvaged materials. Winter temperatures in the Auvergne mountains regularly dropped below freezing. They had insufficient clothing, minimal medical supplies, and before Marcel's grain theft, barely enough food to sustain basic operations. Malnutrition was chronic. Several fighters had died from exposure and disease in the winter of 1941 to 1942. The grain Marcel provided wasn't luxury, it was survival. Resistance. Cells established grinding operations in their forest camps, using salvaged equipment or even hand-grinding wheat with stones. They baked crude bread over campfires, carefully managed to avoid producing smoke that might alert German patrols. A fighter who'd been eating perhaps 800 calories daily, barely enough to maintain basic function, suddenly had access to 2,000 calories. That difference meant the ability to march, to carry weapons, to execute operations without collapsing from exhaustion. Captain Henri Valois, the resistance commander coordinating with Marcel, later wrote in his memoir that the winter of 1942 to 1943 marked a turning point for the Maquis in the Auvergne. Before Marcel's grain operation, the resistance had been on the verge of collapse. Fighters were abandoning the forests, either surrendering to authorities or fleeing to other regions. Recruitment had stopped because nobody wanted to join an organization that meant slow starvation in the woods. After the grain began flowing, everything changed. Fighters regained strength and morale. Cells that had been barely operational became capable of sustained action. Most importantly, recruitment surged. Word spread through the underground network that the Maquis in the Auvergne was fed, organized, and effective. Young men fleeing forced labor conscription, which Germany had intensified in early 1943 with the Service du Travail Obligatoire, began deliberately heading to the Auvergne rather than other regions. By spring of 1943, the resistance network that Marcel's grain had sustained through winter numbered approximately 2,000 fighters across the region. They weren't scattered, starving individuals anymore. They were an organized guerrilla force capable of coordinating complex operations. And they had one crucial advantage that German commanders never fully grasped. They knew the terrain intimately and had the party support, quiet but real, of local farmers and villagers who provided food, intelligence, and shelter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Marcel's operation couldn't remain secret forever. In March 1943, the Gestapo began investigating food supply irregularities in the Vichy region. They'd noticed that resistance activity had increased despite no apparent improvement in the Maquis' supply situation. Someone in German intelligence asked the right question. How were these fighters eating? The investigation initially focused on black market networks in cities. The Gestapo assumed large-scale food theft required urban infrastructure, warehouses, transportation companies, the kind of complex organization that left paper trails. They raided suspected black market operations in Clermont-Ferrand and Vichy, arrested dozens of people, and found nothing connected to the resistance. The food supporting the Maquis wasn't coming from cities. It was coming from a middle-aged farmer and his tiny conspiracy of accomplices. The break in the investigation came from an unexpected source. A Vichy agricultural inspector named Bertrand, conducting routine harvest audits in April 1943, noticed discrepancies in Madame Chevalier's mill records. The numbers didn't quite add up. Her reported grain intake from various farms exceeded her documented flour output by a margin too large to be explained by normal waste. Bertrand might have overlooked it. These records were complex and errors were common, but he was ambitious and saw an opportunity for advancement. He reported his findings to his superiors in Vichy, who forwarded the information to German authorities. The Gestapo dispatched an investigation team to the Auvergne in late April 1943. This team wasn't bored Wehrmacht administrators. They were professional, investigators trained in counterinsurgency. They understood that resistance networks relied on local support and that food supply was the most vulnerable point in any guerrilla operation. The Gestapo began surveillance of Madame Chevalier's mill. They watched who came and went, noting patterns and faces. They interviewed farmers about their harvest deliveries, cross-referencing statements against mill records, and they started following people who visited Father Antoine's church at unusual hours. The investigation was methodical, patient, and increasingly focused on the right targets. Marcel knew something was wrong when he noticed a black Citroën parked on the road near his farm in early May. The car appeared empty, but he spotted a figure sitting in the back seat, watching. Gestapo used Citroëns. Local police drove Renaults. That distinction meant everything. He immediately sent word to Father Antoine through a courier, a teenage girl who delivered eggs to the church weekly as part of her normal routine. Father Antoine convened an emergency meeting with Marcel, Jacques, and Madame Chevalier in the church basement on the night of May 10, 1943. They had to assume the Gestapo knew something, though probably not everything. The question was whether to shut down the operation immediately or continue until they had concrete evidence of imminent arrests. Madame Chevalier argued for continuation. They still had approximately 4 tons of grain in the mill basement. Abandoning it meant waste, and more importantly, meant fighters would go hungry just as the resistance was planning major operations for summer. Marcel disagreed. His priority was protecting people, not grain. If they were arrested, the entire network would collapse. The Gestapo would torture them for names, identify every resistance contact, and roll up cells across the region. Better to lose the remaining grain than risk hundreds of lives. Jacques remained silent, torn between the Durg arguments. Father Antoine, surprisingly, sided with Madame Chevalier. He'd been hearing confessions from resistance fighters for months. He knew they were planning coordinated attacks against German communications infrastructure timed to support an expected Allied invasion. If that invasion came, and the historians would later confirm that Allied planning for Sicily was accelerating at exactly this moment, the Marquis needed to be strong enough to tie down German forces in France. They voted 3-1 in favour of continuing operations for 2 more weeks to distribute the remaining grain, then shutting down permanently. Marcel accepted the decision but insisted on additional security measures. Distribution would happen only every 3rd night instead of nightly. Fighters would approach the church from different directions each time, and they'd prepare emergency plans for destroying evidence if raids appeared imminent. The next 12 days were the most tense of Marcel's life. Every morning he expected to see Gestapo vehicles approaching his farm. Every night, as grain moved from the mill to the church to resistance fighters, he anticipated the sound of whistles and gunfire that would signal a raid. The black Citroën continued its surveillance, sometimes near his farm, sometimes near the mill, always watching. But no arrests came. What Marcel didn't know was that the Gestapo investigation had hit a bureaucratic obstacle. The team conducting surveillance reported their findings to their commanding officer in Clermont-Ferrand, who in turn reported to regional Gestapo headquarters in Lyon. But Lyon was overwhelmed with investigations in May 1943. The Allies had successfully invaded North Africa in November 1942, and Germany had responded by occupying all of France in November of the same year, eliminating the pretense of Vichy's unoccupied zone. This expansion of control meant more territory to police, more resistance activity to suppress, and insufficient Gestapo personnel to handle the workload. The report about mill irregularities and suspicious church visitors sat in a filing system in Lyon for 3 weeks, awaiting review and authorization for arrests. By the time approval came through in early June, Marcel and his co-conspirators had distributed the last of the grain and shut down their operation. The mill basement was empty except for legitimate inventory. Father Antoine's church had returned to purely religious functions. The evidence that might have proven the theft had been consumed by 2,000 resistance fighters scattered across forests and mountains. The Gestapo finally raided Madame Chevalier's mill on June 14, 1943. They arrived with a full team, armed guards surrounding the building, while investigators tore through records and searched every room. They found absolutely nothing incriminating. The mill records, while showing some irregularities that Bertrand had identified, could be explained as clerical errors or normal variation in agricultural processing. There were no hidden stores of grain, no documents linking the mill to resistance activity, nothing that would justify arrests. Frustrated but not defeated, the Gestapo expanded their investigation. They interrogated Madame Chevalier for 6 hours, using psychological pressure rather than physical torture because she was an elderly woman, and they still hoped to maintain some semblance of legitimacy with the local population. She admitted nothing, maintaining that any record-keeping errors were simply mistakes. She was a businesswoman, not an accountant. Numbers sometimes got mixed up. They investigated Father Antoine, searching the church and questioning him about his visitors. The priest explained, truthfully, that people came to church at all hours seeking spiritual comfort during these difficult times. Was it unusual that attendance had increased? Perhaps the occupation was driving people toward faith. The Gestapo found the basement, but saw only an empty storage room. The grain that had once filled it was gone, and without physical evidence, they couldn't prove it had ever existed. Finally, they questioned Marcel and Jacques. The interviews were more aggressive. Both farmers were taken to Gestapo headquarters in Clermont-Ferrand and interrogated separately. The investigators confronted them with the accusation that they'd falsified crop damage reports, hidden grain, and supplied the resistance. Marcel stuck to his story. His crop had been damaged by rot. The German inspector, Lieutenant Weber, had personally verified the loss and reduced his quota. He had documentation proving his deliveries matched the adjusted requirement. What grain was he supposed to have stolen? The interrogation lasted 2 days. Marcel was held in a cell, denied food and sleep, questioned repeatedly in sessions designed to break down his resistance through exhaustion and confusion. But he'd prepared for this mentally. He knew that admitting anything meant death, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. So he maintained his simple story. Crop damage, reduced quota, no theft. The Gestapo had no evidence to contradict him beyond suspicious patterns and circumstantial connections. On June 17, 1943, Marcel and Jacques were released without charges. The Gestapo lacked sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecutions. Madame Chevalier and Father Antoine were never arrested. The investigation was classified as unresolved, and the case file sent to archives. German authorities suspected something illegal had occurred, but they couldn't prove what or who was responsible. Marcel returned to his farm, expecting to feel relief. Instead, he felt empty. The operation was over. He'd succeeded in feeding the resistance through winter, but now what? The Marquis still needed food. The occupation continued. His own harvest for 1943 would face the same German requisitions, the same impossible choice between feeding his family or complying with the conquerors. But something had changed that Marcel didn't immediately recognize. The resistance network he'd helped sustain was no longer desperate and scattered. It was organized, trained, and increasingly bold. Through summer and fall of 1943, the Marquis in the Auvergne conducted dozens of successful operations. They sabotaged rail lines, ambushed German patrols, assassinated collaborators, and gathered intelligence that was radioed to London and used by Allied planners preparing for the invasion of France. Captain Valois later estimated that the grain Marcel provided sustained operations that killed or captured approximately 300 German soldiers, destroyed 14 locomotives, and severed German communications in the region dozens of times. That food, stolen from a farmer's barn and distributed through a village church, had a strategic impact far beyond its caloric value. The broader historical context makes Marcel's theft even more significant. In 1942, when he stole the grain, Germany's grip on France appeared unshakable. The Wehrmacht controlled the continent from the Atlantic to the Caucasus. The Allies had been driven from the European mainland. Resistance movements across occupied Europe were fragmented and barely surviving. The outcome of the war was genuinely uncertain. Food had become a weapon of occupation. Germany's economic policy in France, managed by the occupation administration, aimed to extract maximum agricultural production while keeping the French population at subsistence levels. This served multiple purposes. It fed German forces and civilians. It prevented French resistance by keeping the population too weak and desperate to rebel, and it demonstrated German power over the defeated nation. The requisition system was brutally efficient. German agricultural inspectors assessed every farm's productive capacity based on land area, soil quality, and historical yields. They set quotas that took approximately 80% of production, leaving farmers just enough to plant next season's crop and survive at minimal levels. French citizens in cities received ration cards that provided roughly 1,200 calories per day, below what's needed for normal activity, but sufficient to prevent mass starvation. The black market flourished because official rations weren't enough to sustain life. People sold possessions, jewelry, furniture, anything of value, to buy food at inflated prices from farmers who held back production or from criminal networks that stole and redistributed goods. The black market was technically illegal under both German and Vichy law, but authorities tolerated it to a degree because it prevented population collapse while maintaining the psychological pressure of scarcity. Resistance movements throughout France faced the food challenge Marcel had confronted. You couldn't fight if you couldn't eat. The earliest Maquis groups in 1941 and early 1942 struggled with catastrophic supply problems. Many dissolved. Others merged with better supplied groups. Some devolved into banditry, stealing from civilians, which destroyed the popular support resistance needed to survive. What made Marcel's operation historically important wasn't just that he stole grain. Many people stole food during the occupation. What mattered was scale, organization, and strategic thinking. He stole enough to matter, 16 tons of grain, that sustained 2,000 fighters for months. He organized a distribution network that was secure and efficient, and he understood that this was about more than his immediate survival. It was about keeping resistance alive until it could become powerful enough to matter. By mid-1943, when Marcel's operation shut down, the strategic situation was shifting. The Allies had demonstrated they could conduct successful amphibious invasions in North Africa and were preparing for Sicily. The Soviet Union had turned the tide at Stalingrad, destroying an entire German army. The Wehrmacht was now fighting defensive battles on multiple fronts. Germany needed every soldier, every resource, and couldn't spare forces for occupation duty that wasn't absolutely necessary. This created opportunities for resistance movements. The Maquis in France grew dramatically in 1943 and 44, particularly after Germany instituted forced labor conscription that drove thousands of young Frenchmen into hiding. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, the French resistance numbered perhaps 100,000 active fighters with much larger support networks. They didn't defeat Germany, but they tied down German divisions that might otherwise have been at Normandy. They severed communications, destroyed infrastructure, and created chaos in the German rear areas at precisely the moment when the invasion needed every advantage. Marcel Dupont's grain theft in 1942 to 1943 was one tiny thread in that larger tapestry. But threads matter. Without them, the tapestry unravels. The 2,000 fighters his grain sustained went on to recruit others, train new cells, and conduct operations that multiplied the impact of his initial theft far beyond what he could have imagined standing in his barn that November morning, staring at a requisition order and deciding to break the law. After the war, Marcel never spoke publicly about what he'd done. He survived to see France liberated in August 1944, when Allied forces, supported by massive resistance uprisings, drove the Germans out. He watched the trials of collaborators at Vichy, where men who'd enforced German requisitions were convicted of treason. He received no medals, no public recognition. The resistance network he'd supported was decorated, celebrated, but his specific role remained known only to a few people who'd participated directly. Jacques, his brother-in-law, died in 1948 from tuberculosis he'd contracted during the war years of malnutrition and stress. Madame Chevalier continued operating her mill until 1956, when she sold it and retired. She never spoke about the basement that had once held 16 tons of illegal grain. Father Antoine served his parish until his death in 1959, taking to his grave the secrets he'd heard in confession and the role his church had played in the resistance. Captain Henri Valois published his memoir in 1961, after a delay while he considered whether it was safe to reveal wartime activities. The memoir mentioned Marcel only as a farmer in the Auvergne whose courage and ingenuity sustained our operations through a critical winter. The historian didn't specify exactly what Marcel had done, protecting his identity even decades later. Valois died in 1973, having spent his post-war years documenting the resistance's history and ensuring the stories weren't forgotten or romanticized. Marcel lived until 1981, farming the same land through France's post-war reconstruction and modernization. His children and grandchildren knew vaguely that he'd done something during the occupation, but the specifics remained unclear. French families often didn't discuss the war years in detail. The memories were too painful, the moral complexities too uncomfortable. Some had resisted, others had collaborated, most had simply tried to survive. Which category did you fall into? Better not to examine it too closely. It wasn't until 1997, when a French historian researching Gestapo archives that had been declassified after German reunification, that the full story of Marcel's grain theft emerged. The historian found the investigation file, including surveillance reports, interrogation transcripts, and the ultimately frustrated German efforts to prove what they suspected but couldn't document. Cross-referencing those files with resistance memoirs and local church records revealed the complete operation. By then, everyone involved was dead, but the historian published a detailed account in a scholarly journal, and eventually the story reached Marcel's surviving family. His granddaughter, Claire, learned for the first time exactly what her grandfather had done. She'd known he was a good man, quiet and decent. She hadn't known he was a hero who'd risked everything to feed strangers fighting for France's freedom. The historical significance of Marcel Dupont's grain theft lies in what it reveals about resistance under occupation. We tend to think of resistance in terms of dramatic acts, bombing rail lines, assassinating officers, spying for the Allies. Those activities were crucial, but they rested on a foundation of quieter acts: farmers hiding grain, priests sheltering fugitives, ordinary citizens choosing solidarity over submission. Without that foundation, the dramatic acts couldn't happen. Marcel wasn't a soldier. He didn't fire a weapon or plant explosives. He was a farmer who knew how to grow wheat and had the moral clarity to understand that feeding resistance fighters mattered more than obeying occupation law. His weapons were intimate knowledge of his land, a small network of trusted accomplices, and the bureaucratic incompetence of an occupation regime that never imagined a middle-aged farmer would steal tons of grain right under their noses. The operation succeeded because it was small enough to stay beneath the threshold of German attention until it was too late to stop it. If Marcel had tried to steal 100 tons, the operation would have been impossible to hide. If he'd involved dozens of people, informers would have compromised it. But 16 tons, distributed through a network of 5 people over 3 months? That was just possible enough to work, just invisible enough to escape detection until the grain was gone and the evidence consumed. The mechanics of Marcel's operation reveal something profound about how resistance actually functioned under occupation, far from the romanticized versions that appeared in post-war films and novels. This wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, terrifying work that required constant vigilance and acceptance that any moment could bring disaster. Consider the practical challenges Marcel faced beyond just the theft itself. He had to maintain his cover as a compliant farmer. That meant continuing his normal routines, attending church services where Vichy officials were present, nodding politely when Germans requisitioned other goods from his farm, participating in the social life of his village without revealing the enormous secret he carried. One slip, one careless word while drinking wine with neighbours could unravel everything. His family knew nothing. Marcel made that decision deliberately. His wife, Isabelle, noticed he was gone many nights, returning exhausted and covered in dirt. She asked questions. He told her he was helping Jacques repair farm equipment, a plausible lie since machinery was breaking down constantly during the war and spare parts were impossible to obtain. She probably didn't believe him entirely, but in occupied France, many wives chose not to ask too many questions. Knowledge was dangerous. If the Gestapo interrogated her, genuine ignorance would protect her and their children. The psychological toll was immense. Marcel later told Captain Valois, during one of their few post-war conversations, that the worst moments weren't the actual grain transports through dark forests. Those required focus and attention that left no room for fear. The worst moments were lying in bed afterward, unable to sleep, imagining every possible way the operation could be discovered. He'd picture Gestapo officers torturing Jacques for information. He'd envision Father Antoine being executed in the church courtyard. He'd see his own children watching as he was dragged away to prison, but he kept going because the alternative, letting resistance fighters starve while he obeyed German orders, felt like a slower form of death. Marcel had fought in World War I, serving in the trenches at Verdun in 1916. He'd seen what happened when good people did nothing while evil advanced. The armistice of 1918 hadn't ended his war, it had simply paused it for 22 years. Now the war had returned, and this time the battleground was his own farm, his own conscience. The resistance fighters who benefited from Marcel's grain represented a cross-section of French society that's often overlooked in simplified narratives of the occupation. Not all Maquis were politically motivated idealists. Some were simply young men desperate to avoid forced labor in German factories, a fate that meant years of brutal work, minimal food, and high probability of death from industrial accidents or Allied bombing raids targeting those factories. Others were career criminals who'd found in the resistance a way to continue their lifestyle under patriotic cover. They robbed German supply convoys and Vichy collaborators, keeping some proceeds for themselves while contributing the rest to resistance operations. The line between resistance and criminality blurred in occupied France, particularly as the occupation dragged on and normal legal structures collapsed. Still others were idealists, communists who'd been organizing resistance since 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, socialists who refused to accept fascist rule, conservative Catholics who saw Vichy's collaboration as a betrayal of French honor, Jews who had no choice but to resist because the alternative was deportation and death. What united them wasn't ideology, but the shared experience of hiding in forests, depending on each other for survival, and conducting operations against an enemy that showed no mercy to captured resistance fighters. The grain Marcel provided didn't just feed bodies, it fed morale. Resistance fighters who'd been surviving on perhaps 800 calories daily, experiencing the physical and psychological effects of chronic malnutrition, sudden weakness, inability to concentrate, constant irritability, suddenly had enough food to function normally. That transformation allowed them to think beyond mere survival. They could plan operations, train new recruits, coordinate with other cells across the region. Captain Valois established a training program in winter 1942 to 1943 that would have been impossible without adequate nutrition. Fighters learned demolition techniques for sabotaging rail lines, practiced shooting captured weapons, and studied German patrol patterns and vulnerabilities. British agents who'd been parachuted into France to coordinate resistance activities reported back to London that the Maquis in the Auvergne had transformed from a barely functional guerrilla force into a capable military unit in the span of a few months. London responded by increasing weapons drops to the region. British and American aircraft flew night missions from bases in England and North Africa, parachuting containers of rifles, ammunition, explosives, and radio equipment to designated drop zones in the Auvergne forests. These drops were coordinated through coded messages broadcast on BBC radio, phrases that meant nothing to German listeners but told resistance cells exactly when and where to expect deliveries. The weapons were useless without fighters strong enough to use them. A rifle means nothing to someone too weak from hunger to hold it steady. Plastic explosives accomplish nothing if the saboteur lacks the energy to reach the target and place charges properly. Marcel's grain, stolen and distributed at enormous risk, enabled resistance to actually employ the weapons and equipment the Allies were providing. By spring 1943, the Maquis in the Auvergne had grown confident enough to attempt increasingly ambitious operations. In March, they derailed a German supply train carrying ammunition to units fighting in the Soviet Union. The operation required precise timing, intelligence about train schedules, and the physical capacity to hike 20 kilometers through forests, place explosives, and escape before German patrols arrived. 6 months earlier, before Marcel's grain sustained them through winter, that operation would have been impossible. In April, a resistance cell ambushed a German patrol that had been searching for Maquis camps in the forests. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but it resulted in 8 German casualties and captured weapons that were redistributed to other cells. More importantly, it demonstrated that the resistance could strike German forces and escape, creating psychological pressure on occupation troops, who now had to consider that forests weren't safe, that their patrols were vulnerable. The German response was predictable and brutal. Wehrmacht commanders increased patrols, conducted sweeps through forests, and implemented collective punishment policies where villages suspected of supporting resistance were subjected to reprisals. In June 1943, German forces surrounded the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, rounded up the entire population, and murdered 642 civilians in retaliation for resistance activity in the region. The massacre was intended to terrorize the French population into withdrawing support from the Maquis. It had the opposite effect. Oradour-sur-Glane became a rallying cry for resistance across France. Recruitment surged. Farmers who'd been cautiously neutral began actively supporting Maquis cells. The massacre demonstrated that German occupation wasn't legitimate authority, but naked violence, and that collaboration wouldn't guarantee safety. If Germans would murder an entire village on suspicion alone, then the only rational response was resistance. Marcel heard about Oradour-sur-Glane on June 11, 1943, 3 days after the massacre. The news reached his village through whispered conversations and a brief mention in Vichy-controlled newspapers that blamed resistance terrorism for provoking German security measures. He understood immediately that his own village could face similar reprisals if his grain theft was discovered and linked back to the community. But he also understood that stopping wasn't an option. The logic of resistance, once embraced, was absolute. You couldn't resist partially or temporarily. Either you accepted occupation and obeyed, or you fought knowing the consequences might be catastrophic. Marcel had crossed that line when he first loaded grain onto a cart and drove into the forest. There was no going back. The summer of 1943 brought new challenges. The Gestapo investigation had failed to produce arrests, but German authorities remained suspicious. They increased surveillance of rural areas, deployed more patrols along forest edges where Maquis were known to operate, and pressured Vichy officials to improve intelligence gathering about resistance networks. Informers became a serious problem. The French population under occupation split into complex categories. Active resistors were perhaps 5% of the total. Active collaborators, people who worked directly for German authorities or profited from the occupation, were perhaps another 5%. The remaining 90% fell somewhere in between, trying to survive without taking clear positions. But within that 90%, a small number became informers, motivated by payment, ideology, personal grudges, or simply fear. An informer could destroy a resistance network overnight. One person who knew about meeting locations, drop zones, or sympathetic farmers could provide Germans with intelligence that would lead to mass arrests. Marcel's operation survived partly through careful security, limiting knowledge to just 5 people, but also through luck. Nobody in his village harbored sufficient suspicion to report him, or if they did, their reports weren't taken seriously by authorities already overwhelmed with information. Father Antoine faced the most exposure. His church received a steady stream of visitors, and not all of them were resistance fighters. Regular parishioners came for services, confession, and counseling. Any one of them might notice unusual activity, fighters entering and leaving through the back, and report it to Vichy police or German authorities. The priest managed this risk through meticulous operational security. He established clear patterns. Resistance fighters came only during specific hours, when the church was nominally closed for private prayer. Father Antoine would be visibly present in the main chapel, creating the appearance that he was unaware of activity in the basement. Fighters entered individually, never in groups that would attract attention, and critically, the church maintained its normal religious functions. Services happened on schedule, confessions were heard, marriages and baptisms proceeded normally. The resistance activity was carefully compartmentalized from legitimate church business. Madame Chevalier faced similar challenges at her mill. Workers processed grain daily, and any one of them might notice irregularities in inventory or record-keeping. She managed this through a combination of personal authority. She was a formidable woman whose employees feared her temper, and careful falsification of records that made the numbers appear consistent to casual inspection. She also paid her workers slightly above standard wages, creating loyalty and reducing the temptation to report suspicious activity for reward money. The grain distribution concluded in late May 1943, 2 weeks before the Gestapo raid on the mill. The final bags were collected by resistance fighters on May 27th. Father Antoine personally supervised the clean-up of the church basement, ensuring no grain residue remained that could provide evidence of what had happened. Madame Chevalier similarly cleaned her mill basement and corrected her records to eliminate the most obvious discrepancies, though she couldn't remove the irregularities that Bertrand had already noticed. When the Gestapo finally raided in June, they found nothing because there was nothing left to find. The grain had been consumed, digested, converted into the energy that fueled resistance operations across the Auvergne. Evidence had literally been eaten. This timing saved everyone involved. If Germans had raided 2 weeks earlier, they would have found tons of illegal grain, documentation proving theft, and clear links to resistance networks. The narrow escape reinforced a lesson Marcel already understood. Resistance was about timing as much as courage. You had to know when to act, when to wait, and when to stop. Continuing the operation beyond late May would have been catastrophic. Stopping earlier would have left resistance fighters undersupplied during critical spring months when they were conducting major operations. The window of opportunity was narrow, and Marcel had navigated it successfully through a combination of planning, caution, and considerable luck. The post-war silence around Marcel's operation reflected broader French struggles with occupation memory. France emerged from World War II with a complicated narrative. General Charles de Gaulle, leading the Free French forces from exile in London, promoted the idea that France had resisted occupation en masse, that the true France was the resistance, while Vichy represented a temporary aberration supported by a small minority of traitors. This narrative was politically useful, but historically oversimplified. The reality was messier. Most French people had accommodated occupation to varying degrees, making compromises necessary for survival. Resistance was dangerous and relatively rare. Resisted on a spectrum from active enthusiasm to passive compliance. The post-war French government wanted to emphasize resistance and minimize collaboration to rebuild national pride and unity. Individual resistors like Marcel often disappeared into this constructed narrative. They'd risked everything, but discussing details of their operations meant acknowledging the complexity of occupation, the fact that resistance required support from communities that also included collaborators and informers, that simple moral categories of hero and traitor didn't capture the impossible choices people faced. Easier to celebrate resistance in general terms than to examine specific operations that revealed uncomfortable truths. Silence was also personal. He'd seen friends arrested, tortured, and executed during the occupation. He'd watched neighbors denounced and deported. The liberation brought justice. Collaborators were tried and punished, but it also brought violence. Some people used accusations of collaboration to settle personal scores. Others were falsely accused. The process was chaotic and sometimes unjust. Marcel wanted no part of it. He'd done what he believed was right. That was enough. He didn't need recognition or reward. This modesty characterized many resistance members. The most celebrated resistors in post-war France were often those who joined late, when Allied victory appeared likely and risks were lower. The early resistors, people like Marcel, who'd acted when the outcome was uncertain and consequences were severe, tended to remain quiet. They'd survived partly through secrecy and saw no reason to abandon that approach when the war ended. The grain theft that sustained 2,000 fighters through winter 1942 to 1943 was Marcel Dupont's war. He fired no shots, planted no bombs, killed no Germans, but his contribution was strategically significant. Those 2,000 fighters went on to conduct operations that disrupted German logistics, diverted occupation forces from frontline duties, and provided intelligence that aided Allied planning for the invasion of France. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the French resistance played a crucial role in the campaign's success. They sabotaged rail lines and roads, preventing German reinforcements from reaching Normandy quickly. They cut communications, isolating German units and creating confusion about Allied movements. They provided intelligence about German positions, defences, and troop strengths that proved invaluable to Allied commanders. And they tied down German divisions across France that might otherwise have been concentrated against the invasion beaches. The resistance fighters doing this work in 1944 included many who'd been sustained through the desperate winter of 1942 to 1943 by grain Marcel had stolen from his own farm. Some were the same individuals. Others were new recruits who'd joined established cells that Marcel's grain had kept alive when they might otherwise have collapsed from hunger and despair. Marcel Dupont's illegal theft of 12 tons of wheat, redistributed through a network of 5 accomplices over 3 months, rippled forward through time in ways he never witnessed and probably never fully understood. He was a farmer who grew wheat, knew his land, trusted a few good people, and made one crucial decision to break an unjust law. That was enough to change hundreds of lives and contribute, in a small but real way, to France's liberation. Sometimes that's all history requires. Ordinary people finding the courage to do what's right when the cost is steep and the outcome is uncertain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.